6,000 tons of steel went up over a Belfast shipyard in 1908, and inside it, before a single rivet went cold, a 15-year-old boy was already marked to die. 228 feet of towers and truss and traveling crane rose over the River Lagan that year, taller than Westminster Abbey, built to do one thing: let two ships the size of floating cities grow side by side. Men called it the Great Gantry. It had no mercy built into it at all. Somewhere under that structure, in the years it took to raise the most famous ship in the world, 8 men would fall, or be crushed, or be buried by the very steel they were paid £2 a week to hang. Only 5 of their names survive. The rest were swallowed the way the yard swallowed everything it didn't need anymore, quietly, efficiently, and without a second look back. This is the story of the machine that built Titanic, not the ship, the cage around it. 840 feet of it, standing over Queen's Island like the ribcage of something enormous. And inside that ribcage, ordinary men climbed planks with no rails, passed rivets that could take the skin off a hand, and gambled their lives every single shift on a structure that owed them nothing. 2 ships grew inside that ribcage at once. Olympic first, then Titanic beside her, close enough that a shout from one hull carried clean across to the other. From the ground, on a gray Belfast morning, it must have looked less like a construction site and more like something had built a skeleton first and was now waiting to see what kind of animal would grow inside it. Who builds a cage that big and doesn't plan for what it might cost? Harland and Wolff did, and they paid for that oversight 8 times over. Some of the men who climbed into that skeleton every morning lost. One of them lost twice. A father who buried his son under this same steel, on the sister ship next door, and then, less than a year later, fell to his own death building Titanic herself. We'll get to him. Hold on to that. Because here's the question this whole story turns on, and it will not get answered until the very end. How does a machine kill 8 men building the most photographed ship in human history, and almost nobody, 100 years later, can tell you a single one of their names? The facts that don't add up. 8 men are dead before this story even starts explaining how. Start with the steel that did it. The Arrol Gantry weighed close to 6,000 tons, more than the finished superstructure of most ocean liners of its era. And it stood on foundations poured from 4,000 tons of concrete, driven 40 feet into Belfast mud. It was, for a few short years, the largest built structure of its kind on Earth. 2 ships could rise inside it at once, side by side, close enough that the men working one hull could shout across to the men working the other. That's not an exaggeration for effect. That's engineering fact, and it should already feel wrong, because a structure like that doesn't get built for a project that expects to lose men. It gets built for a project that plans to win. Nobody plans for the 8. Here's fact 2, and it's worse. Men worked the outer hull of Titanic on wooden planks, sometimes better than 100 feet above the ground, with nothing between them and the fall. No rail, no harness, no net. A riveting squad was 4 men, 2 riveters, 1 holder-on, 1 boy who fed the fire and carried the rivet, glowing orange, across open space to a waiting hand. 1 slip, 1 gust off the Lagan, 1 plank that had shifted half an inch since the morning shift, and there was nothing between a man and 50, 60, 100 feet of open air. Fact 3. 246 recorded injuries during Titanic's construction alone. 28 of them severe enough that the company's own paperwork described arms taken off by machinery and legs crushed flat under falling steel plate. That's not counting the near misses nobody bothered to write down, the twisted knees and burned hands that men simply strapped up and went back to work on because a day off was a day unpaid. And companies in 1910 did not pad their own injury numbers upward for sympathy. If anything, the true number was worse than the ledger. Fact 4, and this is the one that should stop you cold. 8 men died building this ship. 8. And the shipyard's own records, a plaque, unveiled a century later at a workers' club a few streets from where they died, can only put a name to 5 of them. 3 men fell, or were crushed, or were buried, and walked out of history with no name attached at all. We are not going to let that stand tonight. We know all 5 names that survive. We're going to meet every one of them. There's a 5th fact, and it's the one that should really bother you. Building the gantry alone, before a single plate of Titanic's hull ever went up, cost more than most entire ships of the era. 6,000 tons of steel, 4,000 tons of concrete, 3 years of skilled labor, just to raise the cage before the real work could start inside it. Harland and Wolff spent a fortune making absolutely certain the machinery would never fail. Not 1 penny of it was spent on a rail, a harness, or a net for the men climbing the machinery itself. That's not an oversight. That's where the money went, and where it didn't. And fact 6, the one we're not explaining yet, the one this whole video is walking toward, is a family. Not a man, a family. A father and a son, killed a year apart, on 2 ships built inside the exact same skeleton of steel, by the exact same kind of fall. We'll tell you his name. We'll tell you what happened to his boy first, but not yet. That debt gets paid in full, later, when you understand exactly what it cost him to keep showing up to work under that gantry every single morning after his son was already dead. Because that's the truth, this steel was never going to volunteer on its own. This wasn't a story about a ship. It was a story about the men holding it up with their bare hands, 400 feet in the air, 1 plank at a time. The mountain that had to move. Nobody builds a 6,000-ton cage over a shipyard unless the alternative is worse. And for Harland and Wolff, in 1907, the alternative was impossible. White Star Line wanted 3 ships nobody had ever built before: Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, each one bigger than anything that had ever floated. This wasn't vanity. Cunard, White Star's fiercest rival, had just launched the Lusitania and the Mauretania, faster than anything White Star owned, and the only way to answer speed was with size and spectacle, ships so enormous that nobody would care which one crossed the Atlantic first. That decision, made in a boardroom, is the reason a shipyard in Belfast suddenly needed infrastructure that had never existed anywhere on Earth. Bigger meant longer hulls, wider beams, taller superstructures, and a construction site that simply did not exist yet. Queen's Island had 4 modest slipways, each one topped by a modest crane. Modest was not going to cut it. Belfast's own ratepayers ended up footing part of the bill to tear 3 of those old slipways down and build 2 enormous new ones in their place. Numbers 2 and 3, extended 100 feet further out toward the water. The River Lagan itself had to be dredged deeper, 50 feet deep, just so a ship this size could be launched without running aground on its own way out. And even that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was overhead. You cannot build a ship the length of 3 football pitches by hand, from the ground, the way shipyards had for 100 years. You need cranes that can lift 10 tons of steel plate to a height of 20 stories, accurately, over and over, thousands of times, without ever dropping one. Harland and Wolff didn't have a structure that could do that. Nobody did. Not at this scale. Not yet. Every major shipbuilding nation in the world was watching Belfast try to solve this problem, because whoever solved it first controlled the next decade of transatlantic prestige. German yards were expanding. American investors, through the same financial trust that ultimately owned White Star Line, wanted proof their money was building something no rival could match. None of that pressure showed up in a blueprint. It showed up in a deadline, and a deadline is the quietest kind of danger there is. It doesn't announce itself with a crack of steel or a scream from the staging. It just sits behind every decision a foreman makes about how fast a plank gets nailed down or how long a crew waits for a second man to double-check a rigging line. So they went looking for the one man in the world who might actually be able to build it. His name was Sir William Arrol, and Harland and Wolff didn't have to think twice about the choice. Arrol had started work in a cotton mill at 9 years old and apprenticed to a blacksmith at 13. And by the time White Star came calling, he had built a career almost entirely out of catastrophe. In December of 1879, the original Tay Bridge in Scotland, the longest railway bridge in the world at the time, collapsed in a hurricane-force gale, with a train still crossing it, and every soul on board went into the river with the wreckage. It remains one of the worst structural failures in British engineering history. The man who designed that bridge died within a year, his reputation in ruins. The company that got the contract to build its replacement, heavier, better braced, engineered to survive the exact kind of wind loading that had killed 70-odd people the first time, was William Arrol's. He went on to build the Forth Bridge and Tower Bridge in London on the strength of that same reputation. Not the man who designs the impossible structure, but the man you call when the impossible structure has already fallen down once and cannot be allowed to fail a second time. That was the resume Harland and Wolff wanted standing over two half-built ocean liners. They didn't shop around. They didn't need to. Arrol's design was almost absurd in its ambition, because ordinary cranes weren't going to beat this problem. Ordinary cranes lifted one load at a time, over one ship, from a fixed point. This job needed something that could reach across two entire hulls at once, without ever setting a load down wrong. 3 parallel rows of steel towers, 11 towers to a row, spaced 80 feet apart, tied together with cross-bracing strong enough to carry the weight of 2 ships' worth of cranes and men, and steel plates suspended in mid-air. At the center of it all sat a revolving crane with a 135-foot reach, for a few years the largest revolving crane on Earth, capable of swinging a 3-ton load from one side of the structure to the other like it weighed nothing at all. Above that, paired traveling cranes rated at 10 tons apiece, riding the length of the gantry on rails, and along the outer edges, smaller 5-ton jib cranes reaching in from either side. 4 electric lifts carried men up into the steelwork. 3 long ramps did the same for anyone who didn't trust the lifts, or couldn't wait for one. By the time it was finished, the Arrol Gantry didn't look like scaffolding around a shipyard. It looked like Belfast had grown a second skyline, purpose-built, made entirely of steel, with nothing underneath it but 2 half-built hulls and the men who were about to spend 3 years of their lives inside its shadow. That's the 6,000 tons this video opened on. Now you know where it came from, and why it had to be that big. Because 2 ships nobody had ever attempted before needed a cage nobody had ever attempted before, and Harland and Wolff was not about to be the yard that flinched at the size of the bill. But could a structure this size actually hold? Could it survive the loads it was about to carry? Not for one lift, but for 3 straight years, thousands of lifts, every single working day. And who, exactly, was going to be standing underneath it while that question got answered? That's where the real fight of this story begins. And it isn't a question the engineering alone can answer. The cage that couldn't afford to fail. You want to know what nearly 200 feet of open steel does to a man's stomach the first time he climbs it. Ask anyone who stood on scaffolding in a strong wind. Now take away the harness. Now make the wind coming off Belfast luff, cold enough to numb your fingers around a hammer. Now put 100 pounds of tools on his back and tell him the shift isn't over until 6. Belfast doesn't do the men many favors, weather-wise. Winter meant ice forming on the steel overnight, invisible until a boot found it, and rain that turned a dry plank into a skating rink an hour before turned it back into a dry plank again. Summer wasn't much kinder. A hot day off the Lagan brought its own haze and glare bouncing off wet steel, enough to make a man misjudge exactly where the edge of a plank actually was. The gantry itself never once slowed down for any of it. There was no such thing as a weather day on Titanic's build. The schedule didn't care what the sky was doing, and neither, eventually, did the men who'd learned they couldn't afford to either. The gantry itself was a machine built to defeat a single, brutal problem. How do you move 10 tons of curved steel plate, the size of a small house, from ground level to the top of a hull 20 stories in the air, set it into position within a fraction of an inch, and do it again within the hour, for years, without a single fatal drop? The answer was a chain of machinery working in sequence, each link only as strong as the one before it. Steam and, later, electricity turned the winches. The winches drove the cable drums. The cable drums lifted the plate off flatbed rail wagons parked directly beneath the gantry. Harland and Wolff had built rail spurs right into the yard for exactly this purpose, and the traveling cranes carried that plate the length of the structure to wherever the riveting squads were working that day. Every joint in that chain had to hold. One frayed cable, one seized winch, one badly poured foundation 40 feet down in Belfast mud, and the whole sequence stopped meaning efficient shipbuilding and started meaning something much worse. The towers themselves tell you how seriously Arrol took that risk. Each tower base measured 21 feet by 9, roughly the footprint of a small house, sunk into concrete piles driven 40 feet into the ground. That's not overbuilding for the sake of confidence. That's a structural engineer who had already put a railway bridge across the Firth of Forth and knew exactly what happens to steel that gets its margins wrong. Arrol had learned that lesson the hard way, on a different bridge entirely, decades before Belfast, and he built the gantry like a man who intended never to learn it twice. Precision was the part nobody outside the trade ever thinks about. A hull plate weighing 2 or 3 tons had to be lowered from the traveling crane and set against the rest of the hull within a fraction of an inch, or the rivet holes wouldn't line up and the whole plate came back down for adjustment. An expensive, time-consuming failure that no foreman wanted attached to his name. So the crane operators worked in a kind of silent partnership with the men on the staging below, inching 1.5 tons of steel through open air on hand signals alone. No radios, no shouted instructions over the noise of the yard, just a raised arm meaning stop and a lowered one meaning down. Trusted absolutely because the alternative, a miscommunication with 3 tons of steel swinging on a cable above a crowded staging, didn't bear thinking about. There's a detail in the engineering that rarely makes it into the documentaries, and it matters more than it should. Before the gantry could lift a single plate for Olympic or Titanic, it first had to lift itself. Somebody had to raise 11 towers, 3 rows deep, 80 feet apart, out of freshly poured concrete and 40-foot piles, and connect all of it with cross-bracing heavy enough to carry 2 ships' worth of load, using nothing but smaller cranes, ropes, and men climbing bare steel that had no gantry above it yet to protect them. The safest structure Harland and Wolff ever built over its workforce did not exist yet during the exact period when climbing without one was most dangerous. Nobody counted the near misses from those 18 months of raw erection work in 1907 and 1908. The record simply doesn't have them. What the record does have is everything that came after, once the gantry was finally standing and the real work, 3 years of it, could begin. What the blueprints don't show you, even once the structure was finished, is what all of that engineering meant for the men standing on it. The gantry could carry 10 tons of plate safely, precisely, mechanically, but it could not, by itself, keep a man's boots on a wet plank 100 feet above a slipway. That part was left entirely to balance, to luck, and to whatever a 19-year-old had eaten for breakfast that morning. The machine solved the problem of moving impossible weights through the air. It never once solved the problem of the men who had to climb up there to guide those weights into place, by hand, 1 rivet at a time. Remember that gap. Samuel Scott fell through it. So did John Kelly, and so did William Clark. 3 names, out of 5 that survive, and we haven't told you what happened to any of them yet. We will. Hold on a little longer. And that gap, between what the steel could do and what the men had to do without it, is exactly where this story is headed next. The shift that never stopped for grief. A riveting squad doesn't run on courage. It runs on rhythm, and the rhythm doesn't care what happened to the man standing next to you yesterday. You're on the plank, 7 in the morning, cold enough that the steel stings through your gloves, 100 feet of open air behind your heels, and nothing between you and the ground but 2 boards laid end to end. Somewhere below, A furnace boy is already stoking the fire that will heat your next rivet. You don't look down. Looking down is how men who'd worked this yard for 20 years still lost their nerve on a bad morning. You keep your eyes on the hole in the steel in front of you, and you wait for the sound that means the rivet is coming. Because it comes to you glowing orange, thrown, not handed, across open space, and if you miss it, it's your hand that pays for the mistake, not the boy who threw it. Picture the squad at full pace, because this is what 3,000 men a day actually looked like inside the gantry's shadow. A furnace burns at the base of the staging, tended by a boy who feeds it rivets by the dozen. When one glows orange hot, he pulls it with tongs and throws it, not hands it, throws it, 20 or 30 feet sometimes, in an arc through open air, to a holder-on waiting above, who catches it, jams it into a pre-drilled hole, and braces it from one side with a dolly bar, while two riveters, one left-handed, one right-handed, hammer it flat from the other. 3 million rivets went into Titanic's hull this way. 3 million times that sequence happened. 3 million chances for a badly caught rivet to sear through a glove, or a badly timed swing to catch a man's hand instead of the steel. So what happens to a body that repeats that motion for 30 years? Nothing good. The noise alone did permanent damage. Men who spent decades on the riveting gangs went deaf by their 40s and 50s, and nobody called it an industrial injury at the time. There was no such category yet. It would take until 1977 for Harland and Wolff to even begin processing the roughly 1,000 compensation claims that eventually came in from men whose hearing the yard had simply taken from them, one hammer blow at a time. Across a working life, nobody warned them would cost them their ears. Hiring was just as brutal in its own quiet way. There was no schedule, no seniority, no guarantee. A foreman walked the yard gates each morning and picked the men he wanted for that day's work. And if your face didn't catch his eye, you went home unpaid. £2 a week, when you were lucky enough to be picked. Compare that to a first-class ticket on the finished ship, over $4,000 for the best suites, and you start to understand exactly what kind of gap this gantry was built to straddle. Unthinkable luxury on one end, and men who couldn't guarantee their own wages from one morning to the next on the other. Robert Murphy was one of those men, 49 years old, a rivet counter by trade, living at 6 Hillman Street in the New Lodge area of North Belfast. He'd worked this yard for years, through Olympic and now Titanic, one of thousands of faces the foreman had learned to pick out of the crowd at the gate. But Murphy carried something onto that steel every morning that most of the other men didn't. His own son had died building Olympic. A fall, the record shows, though the details are thinner than they should be, the way details always seem to thin out around the deaths nobody thought to write down properly at the time. And every morning after that, Robert Murphy still walked back through the shipyard gates. Not because the grief had faded, because £2 a week doesn't stop being necessary just because it already cost you your own child once to earn it. We don't know what Murphy thought about, climbing that steel each morning with his son already in the ground. Nobody recorded his private thoughts, and this script isn't going to invent them for him. What the record does show is simpler, and somehow worse. He kept climbing, day after day, for a job that had already taken everything from him once, because the alternative, no wage at all, was a kind of danger too, just one that didn't come with a 50-foot drop attached. There would have been quiet mornings too, in among all of it. A dinner hour where men sat along the base of the towers with their backs against warm steel, eating whatever their wives had wrapped for them, the noise of the yard dropping for 20 minutes to something almost like peace. Gulls working the lagan for scraps. A game of pitch and toss with somebody's spare coins. Laughter carrying further than it should in the gaps between hammer strikes starting back up. The danger never actually left during those 20 minutes. It just went quiet, the way it does right before the next shift begins. By April of 1910, the gantry had been swallowing men's daylight hours for 2 full years, and it hadn't taken a single one of their lives yet. That streak was about to end, and once it ended, it wouldn't stop for 18 months. The boy who went first. Nobody saw the first one fall. That's the detail this whole chapter is built around, and it never stops being true. By the spring of 1910, near misses were already routine enough that nobody bothered reporting most of them. A dropped rivet that missed a man's shoulder by inches, a plank that shifted underfoot and settled back into place before anyone lost their balance completely. 218 minor injuries would eventually be logged across the whole of Titanic's construction. Twisted ankles, burned hands, the ordinary wear of men working steel at height with no margin built in anywhere. Nobody treated any of it as a warning. It was just Tuesday. His name was Samuel Joseph Scott, 15 years old. A catchboy, the lowest rung on a four-man riveting squad, the one who ran hot rivets from the furnace to the men holding steel together, over open planking, sometimes better than 60 feet off the ground. Scott lived on Templemore Street with his mother and 6 brothers and sisters, crammed into a house with another family besides. He'd only just moved out into lodgings of his own, still on the same street, still close enough to walk past his mother's door most mornings. On the morning of April the 20th, 1910, he collected his work token at the timekeeper's hatch, the same as always, and made his way to ship number 401, the hull that would one day carry the name Titanic. Not one of the hundreds of men working within shouting distance happened to be looking at the exact second he lost his footing on the ladder. There was no cry that anyone remembered, no shout of warning, nothing that separated that particular second from the 1,000 seconds around it. Just a boy on a ladder, and then a boy on the ground. A riveter working further along the staging noticed him afterward, lying motionless below, and it was several minutes, by some accounts, before anyone realized he wasn't simply resting. At the inquest 2 days later, the coroner ruled that death had resulted from shock following a fractured skull. Scott's mother was called to testify. All she could tell the court was that she'd seen him that morning, before he left for work, same as every other morning of his short working life. Samuel Scott was buried in Belfast City Cemetery in an unmarked grave. It stayed unmarked for 101 years, the boy who died first on the ship that would go on to be the most written-about vessel in maritime history. Lying under bare grass, while the world built museums to the ship he never lived to see finished. But could the yard afford to slow down for a death like his? It could not, and it didn't. Work on 401 didn't stop for more than the time it took to carry Scott's body off the site. There was a ship to build, and a launch date already circulating in the newspapers, and 15,000 other men who needed the work badly enough not to ask too many questions about what had just happened 60 feet above their heads. 2 months later, the gantry took its second boy. John Kelly, Johnny, to the men who knew him, was 19. Like Scott, he fell from the staging around ship 401 on the 23rd of June, 1910. His death certificate, still held today in the Ulster Museum, records the cause in language so flat it's almost unbearable to read. An accidental fall from the ship while at work at Queen's Island, followed by shock from his injuries. 2 teenagers, 2 months apart, off the same hull, off the same kind of unguarded staging, and the gantry kept running exactly the way it had the day before, and the day before that. By November, it had claimed a third. William Clark, 27, a driller, slipped from an elevated platform somewhere in the yard. He didn't die instantly. He lingered 2 days, and it was pneumonia, likely from the injuries, from lying in the cold, from a body that simply couldn't fight 2 things at once, that finally took him. 3 men, dead in 8 months, and not one of them stopped the schedule for so much as an afternoon. If you're waiting for the moment somebody in charge decided that was too many, that moment never came. The schedule was the only thing that ever actually got listened to. Titanic launched on the 31st of May, 1911, in front of 100,000 people packed along both banks of the Lagan. 23 tons of soap and tallow had been spread across the slipway that morning to ease her enormous weight down into the water, and hydraulic rams stood ready in case the drag chains failed to slow her once she was moving. She went from resting on solid ground to fully afloat in under a minute. The largest man-made object ever moved by human hands, gone in less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud. It should have been the gantry's finest hour. In a way, it was. And in the exact same hour, it took a fourth man's life. James Dobbin was 43, finishing the last touches on the hull before she went down the ways. As the ship began her final slide toward the water, a loose piece of timber came free somewhere above him and struck him. He was crushed. At the precise moment, 100,000 people were cheering the greatest engineering triumph Belfast had ever produced. Nobody in that crowd knew. The newspapers the next day were full of the launch, the size of her, the roar of the crowd. Dobbin's death barely registered outside the yard gates. That should have been the last of it. It wasn't. Titanic still had 9 months of fitting out ahead of her. Engines, funnels, the entire luxurious interior that would make her famous. All of it happening now inside the dry dock, still under the gantry's reach, still governed by the same planks and the same absence of rails that had already claimed 4 men. And in June of 1911, less than 2 weeks after the launch that should have marked the end of the danger, Robert Murphy was crossing a gangway, high on the ship, when the boards gave way beneath him. He fell 50 feet. He landed hard enough to fracture the base of his skull. Men on the site got him into an ambulance and rushed him to the Royal Victoria Hospital. But the doctors there knew almost immediately there was nothing to be done. He died in that hospital bed, the same institution, very likely some of the same corridors, that had failed to save the last man the gantry had thrown from its heights. A 49-year-old man who had already sat in a room like that one once before for his own son was carried into it a second time, and this time there was nobody left to carry him out again. The Belfast Newsletter covered it 2 days later, on the 14th of June, in a short item about a riveter's terrible fall. The paper laid out the facts plainly: the fall, the fracture, the ambulance, the death, and then added one line that the reporter clearly couldn't leave out, even in a story that was supposed to be routine. What made this accident peculiarly sad, the paper wrote, was that the dead man's son had been fatally injured some time before, working on the Olympic. A father, a son, 2 ships, built inside the same steel skeleton, 12 months apart, 2 falls, 2 funerals. That's the debt this whole video has been carrying since the opening minute, and now you know why we made you wait for it. Robert Murphy was buried from his home on Hillman Street on the 15th of June 1911. The service was brief. A curate from Trinity Church, a slow procession through North Belfast to Carnmoney burying ground. No plaque existed yet to put his name where the public could read it. No headstone marked him out as anything other than one more man the yard had used up and let go. He was the last of Titanic's 5 known dead. 3 more men died somewhere in those same 3 years. The company's own records confirm 8 fatalities total, only 5 identified. And whatever their names were, whatever mornings they walked through those gates for the last time, the records simply never wrote them down. The gantry didn't pause for any of it. 3 months after Murphy's funeral, Olympic came back to Belfast with a gash torn in her side from a collision with a Royal Navy cruiser out in the Solent, and Harland and Wolff had to shuffle Titanic along her own fitting-out wharf to make room. 2 900-foot sister ships jockeying for space under the same steel skeleton that had already killed the men fitting them out, because the shipyard schedule had no line item for grief, only for berths and tides and the next contracted delivery date. What the steel left behind, the gantry that killed 8 men, 5 of them named, 3 of them lost even to memory, didn't survive them by much, in the scheme of things. It stood over Queen's Island for a little over 5 decades after Titanic slid into the water, watching Britannic rise and then leave to become a hospital ship and sink in the Aegean during the First World War, watching later liners come and go under its towers. By the 1960s, Harland and Wolff had reorganized around a larger dry dock elsewhere on the site. The gantry that had once been the largest built structure of its kind on Earth had become, quite simply, in the way, and it came down. The exact year is disputed, even in the shipyard's own history. Some records say the late 1960s, others push it to 1971, reduced to scrap and cleared to make way for a car park. Here's a piece of trivia worth correcting right now, because almost everyone gets it wrong. Those two enormous yellow cranes that dominate Belfast's skyline today, the ones every tourist photographs and half of them assume built Titanic, Samson and Goliath, have nothing to do with this story at all. They weren't built until 1969 and 1974, more than half a century after Titanic launched, standing over a completely different dry dock on the far side of the yard. The gantry that actually killed these men, the actual cage Robert Murphy fell from, was already gone, or nearly gone, before either of those cranes ever went up. The steel people photographed today isn't the steel that mattered here. The steel that mattered here is mostly rust and memory now, scattered in fragments along what Belfast now calls the Maritime Mile, the odd chunk of original ironwork still turning up among the redeveloped waterfront, unlabeled, easy to walk straight past without knowing what you're looking at. What actually remains of the two slipways where Olympic and Titanic were born is smaller than you'd expect for a structure this significant. Two concrete ramps at the landward end, and railway tracks still embedded in the ground beneath them. When Titanic Belfast opened in 2012, on the centenary of the sinking, the site was landscaped around what little survived. Lampposts spaced out to echo the positions of the old gantry towers, and, set directly into the ground where the hulls once stood, full-scale outlines of Titanic's and Olympic's decks, lit blue after dark. You can walk the exact footprint of the ship today, bow to stern, on the same ground where Samuel Scott fell from a ladder at 15 years old, and where Robert Murphy fell from a gangway at 49. Inside the museum itself, there's a steel scaffold reaching 20 meters into the air, meant to evoke the old gantry for visitors. It's an impressive piece of architecture in its own right. It is also, worth remembering, only about a quarter of the real thing's actual height. The genuine Arrol Gantry would have risen 4 times higher than the tribute now standing in its place, which tells you something about how hard it is, even with the best intentions, to build something that properly conveys just how much steel once hung directly over these men's heads, every single working hour, for 3 straight years. It took 101 years for Samuel Scott to get a headstone. It took until 2012, the 100th anniversary of the sinking, not the 100th anniversary of their deaths, for anyone to put up a public plaque naming even 5 of the 8 men the gantry killed, building the ship that made Belfast famous. So what took so long? Nothing dramatic. No cover-up, no conspiracy, just the ordinary erosion of a working man's death, mattering less than a first-class stateroom, decade after decade, until enough time passed that somebody finally noticed the gap. The plaque hangs today at a workers' social club on D Street, a short walk from where the gantry once stood, engraved with the words, "In Memoriam," and 5 names: Samuel Joseph Scott, John Kelly, William Clark, James Dobbin, Robert James Murphy. 3 names are missing. They were missing when the plaque went up, and they're missing still. It was unveiled on the 6th of July, 2012, by Northern Ireland's First Minister at the time, in a short ceremony that made the local news for a day and then didn't. A black slab of marble, a cast impression of a gantry crane pressed into the stone, 5 names in gold lettering, and a silence afterward that swallowed the moment the way the yard had swallowed the men themselves a century before. On the Olympic slipway next door, landscapers later laid a memorial garden, rows of timber decking and green lawn, precisely proportioned to mark out percentages nobody asked to think about on a nice afternoon walk. Most visitors to Titanic Belfast walk straight past both of them on their way to the gift shop. So here's the answer to the question this whole story opened on. How does a machine kill 8 men building the most famous ship on Earth, and almost nobody remembers their names? Because the machine didn't need them remembered to keep running. It needed rivets driven and steel plated and a launch date met and every single morning it got exactly that. From men who understood the risk and climbed the ladders anyway, because 2 pounds a week was the difference between a family fed and a family not. Robert Murphy understood that risk better than any man alive. It had already cost him his son. It cost him everything else the following June. Stand on that plaza today, and the sightlines still work the way the original builders intended, even with the gantry gone. Look toward the water, and you're looking exactly where Titanic went in, exactly where 100,000 people cheered while James Dobbin lay dying under a piece of timber none of them saw fall. Look up, and there's nothing there anymore. Just Belfast sky where 228 feet of steel used to hang directly over the heads of men who couldn't afford to think about it too hard. The absence is the point. You're meant to feel how much used to be standing there, and how completely it's gone. The gantry is gone now. Mostly rust, mostly memory. A handful of names on a plaque outside a football club. A headstone that took a century to arrive. But the ship it built is still the most famous vessel in human history, photographed and filmed and mourned 1,000 times over. Maybe it's time the men who built her got even a fraction of that same attention. They don't make gantries like that anymore, and they don't make men who'll climb one every morning with nothing under their boots but a plank and a paycheck they couldn't afford to lose.